Welcome, friends. I'm Marci, and I lead our narrative and community work here at CoGenerate, where we champion the idea of older and younger people joining forces to solve problems, bridge divides, and co-create a better future. What we call cogeneration, a word you're going to hear a lot today. Last month, we kicked off CoGen Solutions to Loneliness and Isolation, an initiative to identify solutions to the loneliness crisis with a specific focus on older and younger people and how they can come together, not as victims, but as agents of change. As part of that, we are connecting with big thinkers and doers all across the country who have groundbreaking and often commonsensical ideas, practices, and initiatives to share. We'll also be hosting a CoGen Innovators Community of Practice, which is a free 5-week learning experience for innovators and disruptors interested in adopting and growing co-generational solutions and strategies to reduce social isolation and loneliness. We'll talk more on that later, and the deadline is tomorrow, Friday, September 6th. So if that's part of why you're here, stay on till the end, but we'll be sharing the links. You'll also get that information in our follow-up email after this webinar. Today, I'm really thrilled to be able to interview Dr. Jeremy Nobel, whose work I've been following and admiring for quite some time. Jeremy is the author of Project UnLonely. This book, Healing Our Crisis of Disconnection, it's a book that has taught me so much about the roots of our loneliness crisis and potential pathways to healing. Jeremy is a man of many slashes. He is a poet, a medical doctor, a public health practitioner, the founder of the Foundation for Art and Healing, and he has pulled all of these threads together to become a persuasive advocate on the power of the arts to heal and connect us. I could go on and on about Jeremy, who is such an important voice at this moment, both through his public voice and actually through his poetry, but I will instead allow you to meet him for yourself. We want to make sure that you are all part of this conversation, so please send questions into the chat and the Q&A box anytime during the conversation. We will make sure to try to weave them in. And note that I'm sometimes looking to my right screen. That's how I can see the comments that you're all putting into the chat. So without any further delay, let's get started. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, Marci, it's a pleasure to be here with you and all these wonderful people who are tuning in.
Yeah, they are continuing to introduce themselves, which is great. So I first learned about you, Jeremy, because I followed Project UnLonely, the film festival about loneliness that you started. And then I saw you speaking at a panel from our friends at Retro Report, and I immediately knew I wanted to learn more about your work and bring you into this community. So why don't you tell us a bit how you came to focus on loneliness while working as a primary care physician, which was, I believe, when it started.
Well, in fact, Marci, in medical practice, you come across loneliness all the time. It's interthreaded with human experience. It's part of who we are. It's part of how we navigate the world, and particularly associated, as I mentioned in my book, with illness or aging or disability, things that often bring people, into interaction with the medical world. But I also saw loneliness in my own experience in training for medicine. I saw it in my peers. Sometimes it's called burnout. And so that kind of made me sensitive to it. But I don't think I really had a way to engage with loneliness actually until the work we started doing through early activities in the Foundation for Art and Healing, using the arts to engage people, inspire them, and empower them. And we saw that even simple creative work and sharing and making made people feel more connected and less alone.
Wow. I just want to go back to the medical practice just for a moment. Like, what happens in a medical office, and how can and how do primary care physicians and other medical professionals tap into loneliness? Like, are they tapping into loneliness? What is happening and what could be happening in that context?
Well, I think the most important thing we could do is, and it is really one of the goals of Project UnLonely, is to be more aware of loneliness. And also to destigmatize it, to normalize it, to make it okay to talk about. to make it okay to say, I'm lonely. And I think we're just beginning to have that comfort level in the communications we have with our patients. I'm in the Center for Primary Care at Harvard Medical School. We're looking at how we can kind of address some of the so-called social determinants of health within a primary care model, recognizing that it may be beyond what primary care can do to fully address things like social isolation, or homelessness or income insecurity, but to be able to have conversations with our patients about that and the way it influences their ability to navigate the illnesses they may be burdened by, but also health in general, and stay as healthy and well as they can be.
Yeah. So let's like I know you and everybody I talked to in this space was very intentional about the language you use. And I love that your work, both the book and your foundation work, use the UnLonely language, which I think is a really beautiful and positive incarnation of where we can hope to get to. But can you just walk us through some of the basics, like social isolation versus loneliness, and even like types of loneliness that you uncovered and are important to understand?
Absolutely. And I think what I've learned, not only in our work at the foundation, but on through the book and the tours and the conversation, is there's a lot of loneliness literacy challenges. So I'll begin with just some fundamentals. First of all, being lonely is not the same thing as being alone. Being alone is an objective state, right? There's certain lack or presence of human contact of certain types. Being lonely is very different than an objective state. It's subjective. It's how we feel about the gap between the social connection we desire with other people and what we feel we have. And so as such, it's very, very personal what that experience is. And as you mentioned, there are different types of loneliness. And I found this early in our work, and it actually kind of opened up the doors of being more specific about how we invite people to become unlonely. Because if you don't have some sense of the different types of loneliness, I'll get to them in a second, then it's very hard to know what might help you feel unlonely.
Right.
So demystify the types of loneliness. The first is psychological loneliness. Do I have a friend, someone who I can tell my troubles to? The second is the loneliness of systematic exclusion, right? Societal loneliness, because you're rejected or excluded because of race or gender or disability. And then the third is a growing problem, actually, is a kind of spiritual, existential disorientation. Does my life have meaning, purpose? Is there consequence? Where do I fit into the bigger human narrative? Now, you could have all of these types of loneliness intersecting. You can have none of them. But unless you understand some of these, basic categories, it's very hard to even recognize within yourself what it is that you're experiencing. And then most importantly, what might be helpful for you.
Yeah. So we all know, and like loneliness is in the conversation, right? We have the Surgeon General report. We all know that there is an epidemic of loneliness. We've all felt it. So the pandemic was a universal, kind of reckoning. What do you think is behind the recent attention? And is it really a rise in loneliness, or is it really more an awareness of loneliness, or is it both?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and it's really important. So, of course, as media and society starts focusing on a problem, it is on people's minds. And so, there's a real tendency to say, well, I'm feeling uncomfortable or sad, or maybe I'm lonely. And it's a good thing to be asking those questions. But it's pretty clear that there's probably more going on to just increase visibility on it. Here's sadly how we know, which is suicide attempts and rates of suicide are going up, addiction rates are going up, overdose deaths are going up. And these are all, I think loneliness is probably the strongest preventable risk factor for suicidality and addiction. And so there's clearly more than just observation bias, where we're more familiar with it. But I also think while it draws public and personal attention to using words like epidemic and so on, over medicalizing loneliness could lead to some confusion about it, because as the point I make in my book, and I'll make it now, and maybe there'll be some questions on it. Loneliness, this sense that you don't have the connections you want, we almost all experience it from time to time. In fact, I think the sense that you don't have the human connection you want may be the most human of feelings.
Mm.
And it comes and goes for I think many of us. But I think the real thing to be on guard about is when these twinges of loneliness we don't have the ability to recognize and respond to them effectively. So they start to spiral out of control. We become more withdrawn from social experience. We might act a little bit avoidant of other people. But then they notice that and they say, oh, Jeremy doesn't really seem to want to engage. I'll give him space. So our brains become lonelier. We start seeing threat and risk everywhere. We know this from psychology experiments from the 2000s. And then you get into a spiraling situation. So I think the big public health opportunity is to avoid spiraling. Recognize it early, understand why you might be at risk for spiraling. I do cover this in my book as the territories in which spiraling happens. Aging is included. I know we'll talk more about that, but also trauma scenarios, difference, not, sets you up for type 2 loneliness. And even the modern world with its social media and continuous progressive divisiveness, these are all signals that we're at risk for greater spiraling.
Oh my God, Jeremy, we could stay on that and this whole idea of also thinking of public health as what we could do to prevent rather than just treat once we have these problems. But I want to actually get to our particular sweet spot, which is kind of what's going on for older and younger, and how we, older and younger, can come together, perhaps in ways to find solutions for all of us. So let's talk I know there's lots of recent research about older and younger adults being two of the most isolated and lonely age groups. I know you can kind of give us good perspective on what the research is telling us, but your book has a chapter on aging. Your book also talks a lot about what's going on between 18 to 24-year-olds. You do a lot of work on college campuses. I know you just did an entire orientation for incoming Harvard students. So you're working a lot on campuses. So give us a little orientation to what's happening for older people, what's happening for younger people, how they're different to kind of set us up for how they may work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it'll set us up for how creative expression could be a cross-cutting intervention across all parts of the lifespan. But let's talk about that. So starting about 10 years ago, which actually coincides very closely with the ubiquitousness of the smartphone, there's been a growing sense that there's, higher levels of disconnection in younger adults, manifested by anxiety, greater tendencies towards depression, and also just overall withdrawing from quality, and that impairs quality of life, sense of thriving and flourishing. There are probably many factors to it to say, oh, it's just social media and the way it's being used in a comparative, performative way. That's certainly a contributing factor. But also we live in an increasingly uncertain, threatening world where it's not even clear what things are going to be like 20, 30 years down the road in terms of livability on the planet, let alone the ability for any one of us to meet our own personal goals about the kind of lives we want to have. So it turns out that this disproportionate and surprising loneliness in 18 to 28-year-olds is now a phenomenon recognized worldwide. It's not just in the US. Now, the loneliness of older adults has been tracked, and we've been aware of that for decades. And there are many factors for that also. And I think some of that has to do with the time of life where you then start experiencing a variety of loss. You lose loved ones, you lose access to what oriented you to things in your life that were meaningful and purposeful. You also start to lose physical and mental capabilities, things that could actually keep you in touch, like visual acuity and hearing acuity, right? It's very hard to stay connected if you actually get marginalized just simply because of not being able to hear and see things. But then also a sense of, what's ahead for me and where am I going next and what really has mattered in my life. Now, these can also be very rich areas to explore, and we'll get to that when we talk about some of the ways we can then assist both aspects of this cogenerationality in navigating some of the loneliness opportunities.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So I think we have a good grounding in what's happening for older and younger people. Why don't you start with, why the arts? Like, why do you think the arts has this kind of super connection and power or healing power?
Yeah, so I think the arts, we struggle in our society to kind of take the arts seriously as a public health and a personal health resource. It's so important and interthreaded in healthy ways through entertainment, which is fantastic. I love the song that began our setting, for instance. But arts and culture have been fundamental in doing something really critical for a long time. They actually shape how we make sense of the world, social cognition. So music, dance, storytelling, visual art, these are all ways that we orient to the world around us and interact with each other. And so there's a growing body of evidence that, the arts do three things. They change brain, right? Actually, how our brain functions. They reduce cortisol levels, increase levels of feel-good hormones, serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. So at the very basics, the arts make us feel less stressed out and in a better mood. That's not a bad way to connect with people, but they do much more. They actually shift, and there's growing brain research on this, how we either see the world as threatening or as a sense of opportunities. That area of the brain, the social cognition connectome, has been well mapped out, and it turns out that creative arts stimulate those exact same areas of the brain that determine whether we see the world as welcoming and a set of opportunities or threatening and scary. And as we see it as a greater sense of possibilities, that's the basis for empathy, compassion, for getting out of our own, sometimes very small story into the bigger story of human experience. And I think that is the real power of the arts and what can link older and younger folks.
Yeah, so in the pre-conversation, right before we entered here, we were talking a little bit about some of the ways in which older and younger might specifically be drawn to share with each other, whether it's in creating the arts or in settings of processing together. One thing that hit me in your book, you talk a lot about the power of peer groups. For example, I know there's so much work that has been done with addiction and recovery groups, for example, or illness and peer support groups. But let's envision what is innovative and speaking to you about that power of older and younger linking up together, and where do you see the most promise?
So there's lots that goes on in peer-to-peer. We did quite a bit of work with the Veterans Administration that recognized the power of peer groups in recovering from post-military post-traumatic stress. There are many positive things that go on in groups, but the part that I think is most relevant and to what we're talking about, and I frankly think most exciting, is when you're in a group of other people, it's a natural opportunity to share your personal story with others. Now, this has been going on in culture for a long time, and it's also the basis of other healing models, 12-step programs, and so on. But fundamental to effective storytelling is inviting people to do something very hard to do, which is tolerate the discomfort of disclosure. Because to be in a group setting in a storytelling where you talk about, somewhat neutral things like, the climate or sports teams, that does foster a sense of conviviality, but it doesn't foster the same authentic connection as if you're willing to share something, even something that you may be a little embarrassed about, with someone who can respond to it, at the very least, be kind of a thoughtful listener, which is an active form of communication, but often they feel compelled to then return the storytelling favor, if you will, the gift of a story, by sharing something authentic and meaningful from their perspective. And then there's a bond that's formed through the shared storytelling. And we use this in our programming. The arts enhance this. If you throw in a little mindfulness, it often calms people down, makes them even more able to connect and share. And so I think that is really one of the most powerful opportunities in co-generational activities, is just sharing our stories, how we make sense of the world, our hopes and fears about the future, and then connections get formed.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a lot also when you bring in age, a few other things happen, right? So older people tend to see themselves in someone younger. They see, they see reminders of who they once were. I think younger people see role models, see, kind of potential ways to live, especially if they're trying to navigate commonalities or difference in the world. So we've been really interested in kind of films like some films that you've elevated, like the last event we did with Stoop Stories, which is really about neighborhood connections. And our friends over there bring people together through neighborhood stoops. And they did some very specific work on neighbors who are older and younger. It reminds me a little of, also, we've been following the Friendship Bench, which started in Zimbabwe and is now coming to the US, where grandmother age members of the community are trained in some kind of basic mental health listening work, cognitive behavioral therapy, to sit alongside younger community members who may be dealing with emotional issues in a country that has like a scarcity of mental health professionals. And we're fascinated that they chose the older younger dynamic for that kind of venture. So anything else you're seeing or themes that are coming out of the films you've celebrated that might spark the imagination for people thinking about these issues?
Yeah, let me share something that might be surprising, and without going into, what many people feel is a grim topic, the topic of dying.
Mhm.
So I remember very clearly in my teenage years, I didn't obsess about dying, but it was on my mind because it was like, okay, so what is living about? And what's the envelope of experience? Born, thrive, dwindle, die. Okay, where am I on that? Well, I'm now at a very different stage of my life. And, I have a lot of thoughts about dying, and I have a lot of thoughts about living that I'm eager to share in a way because it reminds me of other important times and experiences in my life. In a certain sense, no matter what age you're at, you're both all the ages you've ever been, and you're also all the ages you imagine you will be. And the arts offer a way to almost be like a time machine. So you're in these stories and you're in the moment sharing the stories, maybe somebody 30, 40 years younger than you or 30 to 40 years older than you. That's in the moment. But the stories happened in the past. So you explore the past and you inevitably have a shared sense about what's going to happen next, the future. And you go into that future maybe with a different mood, a sense of not having to be alone, not having to be as fearful as you might otherwise be, that you're going to be going into that exploration. In this case, let's talk about dying, with good company, with others alongside you.
I'm super interested in the death discussion right now. And I think there's also, like, when you think about older people who come from traditions, like all traditions have ways that we think about death, right? So the cultural tradition you were raised in has practices around death. And I think older people are the custodians of that often
Yeah.
and they've witnessed death. They've kind of accompanied people, perhaps. I think what's really interesting is I think a lot of younger people are reimagining how we think about death, how we talk about death. I don't think I heard the phrase death doula before like a decade ago. Like, there are death cafes now. There is this public and openness in some circles in reimagining how we think about and talk about death, even when we are younger. So I think you're onto something with that, the creativity around what might be a grim topic, but could, what's more impactful on how we live our life than knowing we will eventually not have one. So we only have 4 minutes, and I promise people kind of what's coming next. I'm going to ask you one rapid fire question. If you can give us a take-home tip, something each of us could do in our personal lives and maybe for the communities that we are a part of or that some of us lead, what would it be?
Okay, so it's actually 2 tips. I'll bring it to one. One is that I think we have to fundamentally shift our perspective of loneliness and how we imagine it. So many people feel loneliness means there's something flawed about them, they're inadequate, they're incomplete, and somehow they have to get over that deficiency. You know, what vitamins do I take to be unlonely? That kind of thing, because we live in a medical model. How about shifting the perspective and seeing loneliness as a signal, a biologic signal, a powerful one, that we need human connection, just like thirst is a signal that we need hydration. I rarely find anyone who's embarrassed about being thirsty. Why are we so embarrassed about being lonely? And the answer is because we've constructed a cultural narrative. The good news, a cultural narrative that's been constructed can get reconstructed in healthier ways. And so I think that's the first thing. Shift loneliness as a signal, right? That there's something here to explore, be curious about. And then, as I say in my book, take that curiosity, make things, have conversations, whether it's a poem, a doodle, a dance, a letter, anything. Because when you do that making, some part of your unconscious fears sometimes, but also hopes and aspirations become very tangible and becomes something you can share with another person who will then feel very motivated to share back. I don't know why, but we've seen it happen over and over, and I think that's how we can be better connected.
Wow, those are easy to do. I like it. I have my water bottle right here to remind me. Okay, so Jeremy, I can't thank you enough. I want to continue to talk about you. I have the luxury of maybe being able to do that in other contexts. I think I'm going to make sure that you're available to our whole community in our follow-up email. We're going to share lots of links about Jeremy's work, his book, which I encourage you to buy and read and then review on Amazon and do all the things to support the book's success. The Foundation for Art and Healing has events that you could participate in virtually, lots of tools and resources, and a 20th anniversary celebration coming up for people who are in New York. So we're going to send you links to all of those in the follow-up email. And what's coming up next as part of this initiative is more conversations like this with big thinkers and doers and creators. So keep on the lookout for those. As we promised, the CoGen Innovators Community of Practice, the deadline is tomorrow to apply for that. We are calling all disruptors and innovators who are working on co-generational solutions to the loneliness crisis. It is going to be a really powerful cohorting community, and we want you there if this speaks to your work right now. We're going to ask one final poll question, which is going to appear on your screen right now. It just helps us to deliver better content for all of you. So I'm going to read it aloud, but the poll should be appearing any minute. And the question is, after attending today's session, are you inspired to add more younger and older people into your life? Should be seeing that poll question. We'd love you to answer it before you get out of here. Also, there was a huge amount of activity in the chat, and we will download that and share it. We think we got to most of your questions because we were tracking them as they went along. But please continue to follow us and follow Jeremy, and you will continue to learn more about these topics. And we are going to learn more about all of your work through the community of practice and through following up on things you shared in the chat thread. So thanks everyone for joining us today.